Today on No Rules Reviews, I'm going to be looking at Palaces of Carrara, or as my copy is called, the Palazzo von Carrara. It's designed by Kramer and Kiesling, who have famously worked together on a few other games, and it might seem at first glance like a fairly typical kind of Euro game, and in many respects it is, but what it has that a lot of games don't is a really good sense of modularity, a different feeling every time you play it. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on in this review, so let's just dive right in. Palaces of Carrara is a nice tight Euro. There's a familiar feeling of needing to find some extra cash somewhere. The dial for purchasing bricks is interesting. Most of the time you're going to want to rotate to make it cheaper for you, but there's an ever so small chance that you're not going to want to. It's a nice small decision to make every so often, and it never bogs the game down. The fact that each city can only be scored by one player, and only once they have enough buildings there, leads to some neat gameplay. Building a one-cost building in Pisa or Livorno might not seem like a great idea. You want lots of material spent for the big returns. But if you're the first person who builds in a region, you can practically guarantee you're going to score it, because if another player builds there, you simply outbuild them. And maybe the other players are going to think about that and say, maybe I'm not going to bother building there at all. And then just by simply building that one early, one-cost building, suddenly no one's contesting it, and you get all the stuff you want in one of those two places without much effort. And the first time I played Palace of Carrara, I wanted to play it again. Don't get me wrong, but what we're really here to talk about is the modularity. Palaces of Carrara is the best example I can think of what I want in a modular game. Who needs 504 when I can play thousands of different games of Carrara? Every game is built on the same basic framework, but how they play out is vastly different. The only real comparison I can think of is Dominion, but I really can't go into Dominion because I have really strong opinions on Dominion and many of them, but trust me when I say this is the highest compliment I can pay to the game. One game you might have, say, this set of cards, where you're going to be perhaps encouraged to build a lot of different types of buildings in the same location. You might even be inclined to overpay and build in Viareggio using your red, yellow or white bricks. Whereas in another game you might have an entirely different set of cards, and this would give you a very different focus. You'd be focusing on picking up big sets of exactly the same buildings, so you want to put out a lot of the same building, but you might even want to focus on this one card alone. I've won a game simply by building loads of cheap 1 and 2 cost buildings across 3 things and scoring something like 64 points just from having loads of cheap buildings in those places. So there is a lot of differences that can come up just from these little cards. So Palaces has this strategic level where you look at the cards and you kind of have an overarching plan and say, this is what I want to do. On the other hand, you have loads of short-term tactical decisions to make. How are you going to achieve those long-term goals? They mostly revolve around, which bricks should I buy and when to build rather than buy. But you have to react to what the other players are doing, despite the fact it seems like, a nice non-confrontational Euro. Once again, I feel compelled to mention Dominion as a comparison, but I'd say the interaction here isn't quite as subtle as Dominion's, but it's not bludgeoning you over the head like, a mandatory request in Lords of Waterdeep, somewhere between those. So realistically, what are the downsides here? I mean, for starters, it's hard to get hold of and it's only in German. I'll be honest, mein Deutsch ist schlecht, and I can normally figure out what the cards mean without looking at the rules, but you can download them in English, so that's not an issue. My copy cost something like 16 euros, and despite coming from Germany with shipping on top, it was less than the £30 that most games seem to sit at. It generally hits the sweet spot for me in terms of length and complexity. Some games can fall on the short length, but that's not like a bad shortness. That's a shortness due to players looking at the cards and saying, I'm going to rush out the game and maybe try and end on like 10 points when everyone else has 0. And that has happened before as well. I've managed to kind of make the game end really early. The biggest negative I can come up with is the hidden but trackable information. And I'm never really a fan of hidden but trackable information. All that happens here is that you're slightly obscuring the endgame scoring. But a dedicated player could know exactly what everyone's going to score at the end of the game. Contrast this to, say, Lords of Waterdeep, where even though I could have perfect knowledge of the quest that you've completed, I still wouldn't know exactly how many endgame points you're going to score. I assume they have the hidden but trackable information simply to keep the game moving quicker. People can't analyse every single possibility if you could see what everyone had and you're trying to calculate a final score. Maybe the reason as well is that a player doesn't have to end the game when they've got the game ending conditions met. You know, they can sit there and say, actually, I'm going to play out a few more turns and score some other things that I've put down. But I think that mechanic would still work even if it was revealed that you had complete stuff. You know, people can kind of sense the game end unless they're not paying attention, basically. One thing I find a little surprising is that the "if you can take 3 bricks you must choose one of these sectors" rule only applies to the basic game. That was a rule I thought was quite interesting and, you know, occasionally lent itself to a clever play. I'm also surprisingly neutral to the 8 cost buildings, and I'm not certain I like the upgrading rules. The rules about upgrading seem to kind of allow you to transition from one strategy to another, and maybe I feel there should be perhaps a bit more consequence or downside to doing that. And with the 8 cost buildings, I love the idea of upgrading one of your cities with that tile, and that's really, really neat and making that one better. But I think the implementation doesn't really do anything for me. It's just, oh, I buy an 8 cost and I get one of these tiles. And it's not interesting. Overall, I'd suggest anyone should play it a few times, if only to see that something as simple as 4 cards altering game end and scoring conditions can have such a big impact. I wish more games had this style of modularity. I look at something like Cities of Splendor and I ask, why does a trading post have the same requirements every time? Why is the power set unlocked the same every time? If they'd followed Palaces of Carrara's example, and maybe had tiles that you could place there to change them every single game, the value and the replayability would feel so much higher for just a few pieces of cardboard. Certainly, if I ever design a board game, I'm going to take a look at Palaces and try and work in some aspect of this modularity.